Daniel Morgan had always been fascinated by the macabre. As a horror novelist, he thrived on fear, both his own and that of his readers. Yet lately, he found himself at an impasse. His last book had been a flop, dismissed as uninspired, and he hadn't written a word in months. The pressure to deliver something new, something terrifying, was suffocating him. So, when he came across the story of the Surrency House in a dusty old bookshop, he saw it as a sign, a way to rekindle his fading creativity. The Surrency House was a decaying mansion nestled in the heart of Surrency, Georgia, a small town forgotten by time. It was infamous for its hauntings, which had terrorized a family in the late 1800s. The accounts were chilling. Shadowy figures, disembodied voices, objects moving on their own. The family had eventually fled, leaving the house to rot, its doors permanently closed to the public. Or so it was said. For Daniel, this was exactly the kind of story he needed. He made some inquiries and discovered that the house had recently been put up for sale. The townspeople were eager to get rid of it, considering it a blight on their community. With little effort, he arranged to rent the place for a week, just enough time, he hoped, to immerse himself in its dark history and find the inspiration he desperately sought. As he drove down the winding road leading to Surrency, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense woods that lined the path. The air grew heavier the closer he got, a sense of unease settling in his chest. He chalked it up to nerves, a mixture of excitement and fear as he approached what could be the most important location of his career. The town of Surrency was small, its streets nearly deserted as Daniel drove through. A few locals cast wary glances at his car, their faces etched with suspicion and perhaps a hint of fear. He stopped at a general store to pick up some supplies, a week's worth of food, water, and the strongest coffee he could find. As he placed his items on the counter, the old man behind the register gave him a knowing look. "You ain't from around here, are you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly with age. "No, sir," Daniel replied, trying to sound casual. "Just passing through. I'm staying at the Surrency House for a bit." The old man's eyes widened in shock, his hand freezing mid-scan. "The Surrency House? Boy, you got no business going up there. That place is cursed, has been for as long as I can remember." Daniel forced a smile, trying to ease the tension. "I've heard the stories, but I'm not afraid of a few old ghost tales." The old man's expression hardened. "It ain't just stories. People who go up there, well, they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." A chill ran down Daniel's spine, but he pushed it aside. "Thanks for the warning," he said, handing over the cash and grabbing his bags. As he walked out, the old man called after him, "You watch yourself, son. That house ain't no place for the living." Daniel didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind as he drove the last few miles to the house. The Surrency House stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, hidden from view by the surrounding forest. It was a towering structure, its once grand facade now crumbling with age. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the encroaching twilight. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached, the trees around the property swaying gently in a breeze he couldn't feel. He parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. As he stared up at the house, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The stories, the warnings, they all came rushing back, gnawing at his resolve. But he shook it off, reminding himself why he was here. This was a chance to make something great, to write a book that would send shivers down the spines of readers everywhere. With a deep breath, he grabbed his bags and headed inside. The interior of the Surrency House was even more decrepit than Daniel had expected. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The wooden floors creaked ominously under his weight as he made his way through the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, revealing the bare wood underneath. Daniel found the study at the end of the hall, a large room with high ceilings and a single, massive window that overlooked the tangled garden outside. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly shapes that stood silently in the gathering gloom. He pulled the sheet off the desk and found an old typewriter sitting atop it, its keys yellowed with age. He smiled at the sight, feeling a strange sense of connection to the past. The room felt like a time capsule, preserved in the exact state it had been left in over a century ago. Daniel set up his laptop on the desk, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the stillness of an abandoned house. Shaking off the unease, he settled into the chair and began to type, the familiar clatter of the keys filling the room. But the words came slowly, his thoughts scattered by the weight of the silence around him. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of the leaves outside seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. Daniel's focus wavered, his eyes drawn to the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners of the room, darker than they should have been. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the clacking of the keyboard. Daniel paused, straining to hear, but they faded into silence. He shook his head, laughing at his own jumpiness, and returned to his writing. But the whispers came back, this time louder, more distinct. They were low and guttural, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the edge of understanding. Daniel's fingers froze on the keys, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly in his chair, scanning the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The shadows remained still, the air quiet. But the whispers continued, now coming from somewhere deeper within the house. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, and grabbed the flashlight he had brought with him. The beam of light cut through the darkness as he stepped out of the study, the whispers growing louder with each step he took. They seemed to be coming from the basement, a place he hadn't yet explored. The door to the basement was old, its wood warped and cracked with age. Daniel hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, as the whispers swirled around him, urging him to open it. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and pulled the door open, revealing a steep staircase descending into pitch blackness. The smell of damp earth and rot wafted up from below, making him gag. He shone the flashlight down the stairs, the beam illuminating a dirt floor at the bottom. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were coming from just behind the door. Daniel took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to close the door and leave. But something compelled him to stay, a morbid curiosity driving him forward. He took the first step down, the wood creaking loudly under his weight. Then another, and another. The temperature dropped sharply as he descended, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. The whispers were all around him now, filling his ears, pressing against his skull. He could feel them in his bones, vibrating through his body. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he swept the flashlight around the basement. It was a large, open space, its walls lined with shelves holding old, dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate, its lid slightly ajar. Daniel's heart raced as he approached the crate, the whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. He hesitated, then reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old, yellowed human bones, arranged neatly as if someone had taken great care in placing them there. A skull sat atop the pile, its empty eye sockets staring up at him. Daniel stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as a wave of nausea hit him. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the voices angry and insistent. The crate slammed shut on its own, the force of it sending a shockwave through the room. In a blind panic, Daniel scrambled up the stairs, the whispers chasing him, clawing at his mind. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. The house was silent again, the whispers gone, but the terror remained, gnawing at his sanity. He fled to his bedroom, locking the door behind him and collapsing onto the bed. The adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him awake for hours, his mind replaying the events in the basement over and over. It wasn't until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows that he finally fell into a fitful sleep. Daniel woke with a start, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to his consciousness. He sat up in bed, his heart still racing as he tried to shake off the fear that had followed him into the waking world. The events of the previous night felt like a bad dream, but the lingering unease told him it had been all too real. The morning light did little to dispel the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house was pressing down on him. He forced himself to get up, determined to make sense of what had happened. There had to be a logical explanation for what he had seen, something that would put his mind at ease. But as he made his way downstairs, the unease only grew. The house was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence of something waiting, something watching. He avoided the basement door, unwilling to face whatever was down there just yet. Instead, he returned to the study, hoping to find some distraction in his work. The typewriter was still sitting on the desk, an ominous reminder of the night before. Daniel hesitated, then sat down in front of it, his fingers hovering over the keys. He had come here to write, to create something terrifying and unforgettable. But now the fear was too real, too close to home. He tried to focus, to push the fear aside and channel it into his writing. But the words wouldn't come. His mind kept drifting back to the basement, to the crate of bones and the whispers that had haunted him. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more defined, as if they were closing in on him. A chill ran down his spine, and he turned his head, expecting to see something lurking in the corner. But there was nothing there, just the same empty room, the same oppressive silence. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself that it was all in his head. But then the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A flicker of darkness at the edge of his vision, a shift in the way the light fell on the walls. But soon, the movement became more pronounced. The shadows stretched and twisted, their forms elongating into grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the shadows dance across the walls, their movements erratic and unnatural. They grew darker, more defined, as if they were solidifying, becoming something more than just a play of light and dark. The air grew colder, the temperature in the room dropping rapidly as the shadows closed in on him. He stood up, backing away from the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows followed him, crawling across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, their forms twisting into nightmarish figures. Faces appeared in the darkness, grotesque and distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They filled the room, pressing in on him from all sides, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear. Daniel stumbled back, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, from the darkest corner of the room, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, its form cloaked in shadow, with no discernible features. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. Daniel's blood ran cold as the figure approached, its footsteps silent on the creaking floorboards. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were trying to warn him, to urge him to run. But Daniel was frozen in place, his body paralyzed by fear. The figure stopped a few feet away, its faceless head tilted as if observing him. Then it spoke. "Daniel." The voice was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a declaration of his presence, his identity. The figure knew him, knew who he was, and why he was there. "Daniel," it repeated, its voice dripping with malice. Daniel's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Was this the spirit of the man who had lived in the house? The murderer who had tortured and killed his family? The thought sent a wave of terror through him. But there was something else, something deeper, more primal. The figure pointed towards the study door, its hand emerging from the shadows like a claw. The gesture was clear. It wanted Daniel to follow, to leave the room and face whatever lay beyond. But every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to avoid whatever horror awaited him outside. The figure remained still, its finger pointing unwaveringly towards the door. The shadows writhed around it, their movements growing more frantic, more desperate. The whispers were a cacophony now, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sound. With a shaky breath, Daniel forced himself to move. He didn't know why, didn't understand what compelled him to obey the figure's command, but something deep inside him, something beyond reason, told him he had no choice. He had to follow. He walked slowly towards the door, his legs trembling with each step. The shadows parted before him, their forms twisting and curling around the figure as he passed. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The figure remained in the study, its presence a looming threat that seemed to fill the entire house. But as Daniel stepped into the hallway, the whispers faded, the shadows retreating into the corners. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The house was silent again, but it was a silence filled with anticipation, with the promise of something terrible lurking just out of sight. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and Daniel's breath came out in visible puffs of steam. He reached the end of the hallway and found himself standing before the basement door once again. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through him, but he couldn't turn back. The figure's command still echoed in his mind, driving him forward. With trembling hands, he opened the door and descended into the darkness once more. The basement was exactly as he had left it, damp, cold, and filled with the stench of rot. The crate of bones sat in the center of the room, its lid now firmly closed. But the whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on him from all sides. Daniel approached the crate cautiously, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But it remained still, the skull inside staring up at him from beneath the wooden lid. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the crate. The wood was cold, almost unnaturally so, and he pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he stumbled back, his vision blurring. The walls of the basement seemed to close in on him, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that danced at the edges of his vision. Then, from the darkness, the figure emerged once more. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form cloaked in shadow. But this time, there was something different about it, something more menacing, more dangerous. The air around it seemed to crackle with malevolent energy, the temperature dropping even further as it approached. The figure stopped a few feet away, its faceless head tilted as if observing him. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its clawed hand reaching out to grab him. Daniel tried to move, to escape, but his body refused to obey. The figure's hand closed around his throat, its grip cold and unyielding. Daniel gasped for air, his vision darkening as the figure tightened its hold. The shadows closed in around him, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock him, to taunt him in his final moments. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a chorus of voices screaming in his ears. Just as he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, the figure released him. Daniel fell to the floor, gasping for air, his body trembling with fear. The figure loomed over him, its presence filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. "Leave this place," the figure hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl, "or suffer the same fate as those who came before you." Daniel's mind raced, trying to comprehend what the figure was saying. Was it warning him? Threatening him? Or was it something else entirely? The figure remained still, its faceless head staring down at him. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, melting back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The darkness swallowed it up, leaving Daniel alone in the basement, the echoes of its warning still ringing in his ears. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get out of the house, had to leave before whatever malevolent force that haunted it claimed him as its next victim. But as he turned to flee, something caught his eye. The crate had been opened, its lid now lying on the floor beside it. Inside, the bones had been rearranged, their forms twisted and broken as if they had been torn apart by some unimaginable force. The skull sat atop the pile, its empty eye sockets staring up at him in silent accusation. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he stumbled back, his mind reeling. The figure's warning echoed in his mind, its words filling him with a sense of impending doom. He had to leave, had to escape before it was too late. But as he turned to flee, the basement door slammed shut, trapping him in the darkness. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming in his ears. The shadows twisted and writhed, their forms growing more grotesque, more monstrous. The figure emerged once more, its presence filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. This time, there would be no escape. Daniel's mind broke, the fear overwhelming him. The last thing he saw was the figure's faceless head staring down at him, its clawed hand reaching out to claim him. Then there was only darkness. The Surrency House stood silent and still, its windows dark and empty. The wind howled through the trees, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. Inside, the house was as it had always been, empty, abandoned, a relic of a past long forgotten. But deep within its walls, something stirred. In the basement, the crate of bones lay undisturbed, its contents now complete. The figure stood over it, its faceless head tilted as if observing its handiwork. The shadows twisted and writhed around it, their forms growing more grotesque, more monstrous. The figure remained still, its presence filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, melting back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The darkness swallowed it up, leaving the basement silent and still. But the house was not empty. In the study, the typewriter sat on the desk, its keys stained with blood. A single sheet of paper lay in the tray, the words written on it smeared and unreadable. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. And somewhere, deep within the walls of the house, a new whisper began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside, but it grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear. The Surrency House was not done. It would never be done. For the house was alive, its walls filled with the memories of those who had come before. It was a place of death, of torment, of unimaginable horror. And it would continue to claim new victims, to feed on their fear, their pain, their souls. The whispers grew louder, filling the house with their ominous presence. The shadows twisted and writhed, their forms growing more grotesque, more monstrous. The Surrency House was awake, and it was hungry.